Humans are an ambitious thing.
One giant leap for mankind.
We feel the need to always move forward, and in regards to technology, we are. But as is the way with most things, our desire for innovation comes at a price, because karma lives in all things. These environmental injustices are protested by the world, rightfully so. But what if another form of pollution existed that was invisible to us? Would it be more difficult to notice its effects? Would enough people care before it was seemingly too late?
The biggest danger from cell phones, by far and away, is texting and driving. It has nothing to do with cancer.
Precisely.
Current estimates gauge that just north of 5 billion persons have a cell phone, using apps that send and receive electromagnetic radiation, or EMR.
You can't see it or hear it.
Electromagnetic radiation.
This form of radiation occurs naturally on our planet, but with the rapid advancement in wireless technology, some experts claim the proliferation of man-made artificial EMR is dangerous to human health.
These are the common symptoms that people start to experience. This is actually from a published paper on the health effects of wireless smart meters.
As speaking now as a biologist and as a physician, was not designed to deal with the explosion of EMF activity in the environment. It's not just in the air, but in the land and the sea, everywhere. There's EMFs everywhere. You can't escape it.
Electromagnetic radiation exists on a spectrum, ranging from ionizing radiation, like X-rays, which can move through you and take pictures, to non-ionizing radiation, like microwaves, which can heat up your favorite snack. Our cell phones, tablets, Wi-Fi routers, smart gadgets, and smart meters are all emitting and receiving microwave radiation, or RF radiation. Wireless technology emits and receives radiation with less than 2 watts of power. This causes only a tiny amount of warming, significantly less than the 1,000 watts used by microwaves. Fake videos went viral in 2008, showing what appeared to be cell phones popping popcorn. But as you can see, if you try this for yourself, it's bogus. The experts sounding the alarm on the harms of RF exposure are not doing so because of its very low heat emissions, but from the growing evidence that suggests the continuous use of our wireless devices come with side effects.
We know that radio frequency radiation of 3G and 4G are associated with a whole variety of different human health effects.
Current public exposure levels are at least 1 quintillion, that's 18 zeros, 1 quintillion times above natural background radiation, according to Professor Olle Johansson of the Karolinska Institute in Sweden.
And there are studies, for instance, on the blood-brain barrier leakage, where the rats were exposed for 1 minute. Not 1 year or anything like that, 1 minute. And at a very low exposure level compared to what you and I should stand, and they got this dramatic leakage of the blood-brain barrier.
The blood-brain barrier is a filtering mechanism in the brain that blocks the passage of certain substances. Once compromised, it becomes more porous, allowing bacteria and other toxins to infect the brain tissue, resulting in inflammation or sometimes death. The barrier can be compromised from blunt force trauma, high blood pressure, developmental disorders, and exposure to radiation, including microwave radiation. This leakage is more common among children because a child's skull is much thinner. In the Journal of Microscopy and Ultrastructure, authors conducted a meta-analysis of peer-reviewed cell phone exposure studies from 2009 to 2014, concluding that children and unborn babies do face a greater risk for bodily damage that results from microwave radiation given off by wireless devices.
This happens to be called a TES 593 meter. So you can see it's ranging from 0.5, 0.7.
There is no safety level for microwave radiation
for children. Not one.
The brain of a child absorbs twice as much radiation as an adult. That's a stunning fact.
Okay, folks, 100 times higher than what I'm calling.
An increasing number of countries around the world are banning the use of Wi-Fi in schools.
In Israel, as well as France, as well as Belgium and Taiwan, there's an active government program to discourage the use of mobile devices by young children.
Now it's in airplane mode, so I feel okay just to show you this. Why? Why would you ever do this to yourself?
The cell phone radiation gets all the way through into the eyes of a child age 6 that might have a phone next to their brain. The consequences, remember, that brain is not protected with myelin, and therefore the exposures of anything to it are going to have a greater impact.
The Education Department says it follows world guidelines on Wi-Fi and advises schools to limit children's exposure.
You are putting it over here. This is called the temporal portion of your skull.
Dr. David Carpenter is a world-renowned expert in environmental toxins in Albany, New York.
The weight of the evidence demonstrates clearly that exposure to radiofrequency radiation causes disease. The evidence is strongest for cancer.
The thinnest bone in your body, which gives the most likelihood that that radiation is going to penetrate into your brain. And if you're a child, that bone is even thinner. This is why this is a really serious issue in children.
There's a new world coming, and it's just around the bend.
One reason scientists study rats is because their genetic, biological, and behavior characteristics closely resemble those of humans, and many symptoms of human conditions can be replicated in mice and rats. And this is Dr. Leif Salford. He's a neurosurgeon at Lund University Hospital and chairman of the Department of Neurosurgery. Since the late 1990s, he's led a team of researchers who have exposed thousands of laboratory rats to cell phone radiation, showing that even a very small amount can damage the blood-brain barrier. His results have remained consistent, and he calls the potential implications of his results terrifying.
We learned that the rats that had the lowest energy levels, not 1 watt per kilo, not 100 milliwatts per kilo, not even 10 milliwatts per kilo, but 1 milliwatt per kilo, and even 0.1 milliwatt per kilo, are those energies that open the blood-brain barrier most efficiently.
Shut him up. We have a lot invested in this ride. Shut him up!
Many ask, however, if cell phones are damaging the blood-brain barrier, why haven't we seen a rise in brain tumors or brain cancer?
Since 1980s, when cell phones started to come out, till today, there's no change in the incidence of brain cancer in the United States, in Australia, in Europe. All of them, there were studies done showing no real difference.
This fails to consider latency, which is the amount of time that elapses between initial exposure and the diagnosis of cancer.
From studies of the Hiroshima bombing, we know that brain cancer did not show up at all as increased until 40 years after that bombing occurred.
If there was a real hazard out there, but it could be another 15 years before we see it, think about the billions of people who are being exposed to cell phone RF on a regular basis. We can't undo that exposure.
But even if one completely dismisses the reality of latency, evidence shows that a particular kind of tumor has risen substantially, but the rise is difficult to find given the straight line in the mean average. Rates of glioblastoma, otherwise called glioma or GBM, are rising, with the placement of the tumor occurring in the temporal and frontal lobes. In one study, titled Brain Tumors Rise in Glioblastoma, authors stated in the abstract that this rise is mostly hidden in the overall data by a reduced incidence of lower-grade tumors. The World Health Organization says there are some indications of an increased risk of glioma for those who reported the highest 10% of cumulative hours of cell phone use.
The reality is there's a significant increase in glioblastomas. Unfortunately, they're very, very deadly.
I have listed peer-reviewed studies establishing the connection between non-thermal radiofrequency radiation from cell phones and brain cancer known as glioblastoma.
The WHO has classified EMF as possibly carcinogenic to humans, Group 2B, a category used when a causal association is considered credible. A study in Sweden, published by Environmental Research and Public Health, reported that brain tumors increased from 2007 to 2015, saying the use of wireless phones should be considered in relation to the change of incidence rates. According to the Journal of Environmental Health, long-term mobile phone use shows an almost doubling of the risk of head tumors. And the Journal of Environmental Research states that long-term use of mobile phones shows a decreased survival of glioma patients, claiming that RF exposure should be regarded as a human carcinogen.
Now watch what happens when I move away. 7, under 10. So just by moving the distance 2 or 3 feet, you're reducing the radiation by 90%.
One might be thinking, however, that these studies are correlation-causation fallacies. Just because there's a rise in glioblastomas doesn't mean it's because of our cell phones. But in 2016, findings from a massive $30 million study by the National Toxicology Program were made public.
A major U.S. government study on rats finds a link between cell phones and cancer.
Very first government study linking the radiation from cell phones to cancer.
2-decade, $30 million federal study out today found there is some evidence of a link between cell phone radiation and brain cancer.
The study was led by Dr. David McCormick at the Illinois Institute of Technology, where they exposed rats to the same radiation emitted from cell phones. If this study had found no effects at all, then we could much more easily dismiss previous studies linking long-term cell phone use to the glioma tumor. But that's not what happened.
And then they found a link to 2 types of tumors?
Right, gliomas and schwannomas.
Bocock's brain, the top quarter responsible for body balance, has had to be removed after surgeons found this vast tumor right where he held the phone.
NTP uses 4 categories to summarize the evidence that a substance may cause cancer: no evidence, equivocal evidence, some evidence, and clear evidence. They found clear evidence of glioma tumors. This supports earlier findings associating gliomas with long-term exposure to RF radiation from cell phones.
These results are quite important because the incidence of the brain tumors and the schwannomas of the heart support that IR conclusion based on gliomas and acoustic neuromas among long-term cell phone users.
Some argue, however, that the levels used in this study were much higher than those we're ever exposed to. But this rebuke has been largely overblown.
Our studies are designed specifically to mimic the human exposure scenario. The NTP studies are looking at exposures for 10 hours a day. There's heavy cell phone users that may approach the 10-hour mark. That may be excessive, but it allows us to fully investigate whether or not there is an effect of cell phone frequency radiation.
Many who say this study's RF levels were much higher than what we've ever been exposed to might not be considering a variety of factors. For instance, have you ever had poor cell reception?
A new study shows that using your cell phone in certain areas can increase your exposure to radiation by 10,000 times.
Scientists at the California Department of Public Health showed the lower your cell phone reception is, especially if it's very low, the higher the radiation.
With a weak signal, what happens is your phone puts out a lot more radiation to make the connection with the cell tower. So this would strongly urge people that people should not use cell phones in elevators or moving vehicles or on public transit, because not only are you exposing yourself to very high levels of cell phone radiation, you're exposing all those people near you.
Also, what happens when my house has smart meters just outside of it? and I'm inside, using my phone, while also watching a smart TV with my router in the same room, and my tablet, which I'm not using but is still on, and sending and receiving radio frequency waves to the tower outside my neighborhood 900 times a second, and which usually holds 2 to 5 antennas inside of it, is right next to me. Haven't you ever tried to sign onto your Wi-Fi, only to notice multiple other accounts pop up? Those are also adding higher levels of EMF, on top of everything else that was just mentioned.
In normal mode, my iPhone registered 286 millivolts per meter. But watch what happens when I turn on the Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and make a phone call. Now the RF radiation jumps to a high reading of nearly 6 volts per meter. Compared to 286 millivolts, that's 20 times more radiation.
Your level of exposure also depends on where you live. This graph is a country comparison of RF exposure guidelines set by the government, measured in microwatts per centimeter. As you'll notice, Salzburg, Liechtenstein, Bulgaria, and Luxembourg are all below 3 microwatts per centimeter. Switzerland uses 4.25 for schools and hospitals and 9.5 for the general public. China's limit is set at 10. And in the good old US of A, and with this amount of scientific information, it's no wonder that just like smoking cigarettes, insurance companies exclude coverage for EMF radiation. This is because EMFs are classified as a pollutant alongside smoke, chemicals, and asbestos.
I want to tackle the subject of insurance. You know that neither Lloyd's of London nor Swiss Re will underwrite liability policies for electromagnetic radiation because they think the health risk is too great. In other words, they believe that when the lawyers get involved, and I know many of them, the companies who deliver this radiation to the public could be wiped out.
How many of you know that 1 in 6 American couples is unable to have a child when they want to? How many of you know that last year the birth rate in this country dropped the most that it ever has in recent history, 3% in a single year?
When people go to the Cleveland Clinic or go to infertility clinics all over the world, one of the first things doctors say to them is, where do you use your phone and get it out of your pocket? Because the data on that are rock solid. Cell phones can damage sperm quantity and quality.
A meta-analysis of all the literature on the effects of mobile phone radiation on male reproduction say the results of these studies have shown that RF EMR decreases sperm count and motility and increases oxidative stress. These abnormalities seem to be directly related to the duration of mobile phone use.
Such a dramatic effect that they suggest women might not want to pocket their cell phones for a few days after trying to get pregnant so as to not put the sperm at further risk.
Oxidative stress refers to elevated intracellular levels of reactive oxygen species that damage DNA. The effects from oxidative stress include diabetes, hardened blood vessels, inflammatory conditions, high blood pressure, heart disease, and cancer. A meta-analysis of studies on the potential for EMF causing oxidative stress was recently published by Oxidants and Antioxidants in Medical Science. They said they found altogether 80 currently available papers, of which a remarkable part, 92.5%, reported the detection of significant oxidative stress, saying it is clear that the substantial overproduction of ROS under low-intensity RF exposure could cause a broad spectrum of health disorders and diseases, including cancer in humans. There are studies that present another side to the story, but they're often funded by industry and misleading. A great example is a recent study from Australia managed by Ken and Croft, who found no rise in glioma tumors associated with a rise in cell phone use. But they omitted every tumor diagnosis from those who were 60 years old and older. The average age for the onset of glioma is 62, with the greatest incidence in people 65 and older. So if you're trying to find a nationwide rise in glioma, why leave out a demographic that has the majority of tumors? A simple Google search will show that those 60 and up hold the bulk of tumor cases. A recent study in England found glioma tumors nearly doubled, with the majority of the rise, 63%, found after the age of 59. The authors of the England study criticized the work of Ken and Croft, saying if we had eliminated that group, we would have reached a similar conclusion, saying the Australian paper is nothing more than misleading pseudoscience and should be withdrawn. Ken and Croft do acknowledge the noticeable rise in glioma for younger patients, but attribute every case to advancements in MRI technology. Unlike the research I just mentioned, most of which were independent, the Australian study was funded by the National Health and Research Council, a federal government agency who have been criticized by many in the scientific community for having lobbyists and proponents on their committees. And in one instance, lobbyists and proponents made up a 2/3 majority on the committee.
Practice these words in front of the mirror. Although we are constantly exploring the subject, currently, there is no direct evidence that links cell phone usage to brain cancer.
But there's one organization that goes farther than anyone, claiming that cell phones are completely safe. The leaders and high members of the FCC have been a revolving door of lobbyists for big teleco. NCTA and CTIA are the largest telecom lobbying groups in the U.S. It's their job to ensure the public continues to believe their wireless products are safe for everyone. Former FCC Chairman Michael Powell was and still is president of NCTA. In 2009, Meredith Atwell Baker was brought onto the FCC board. She was then and still is Chief Executive Officer of CTIA, which recently spent 3 times the amount than Sprint did on lobbying expenses, and is currently battling Berkeley in the Supreme Court over the city's new right-to-know law.
You'll find an RF exposure warning in most cell phones, but city leaders here in Berkeley want a warning like this posted inside cell phone stores.
This proposal would irresponsibly alarm consumers into questioning the safety of cell phones.
I love my iPhone. I just know not to hold it to my head or to my body.
Most cell phones have a warning in them that say to hold the phone away from your body to avoid radio frequency exposure, but most of us don't know about this warning. And tonight, the Berkeley City Council decided you have a right to know, and people in Berkeley will be told when they buy a phone.
The good news is the city listened. The bad news is they were then sued by CTIA, claiming they'd violated their free speech. The law has now been sent back to the Ninth Circuit for further review. And in 2013, President Obama appointed Tom Wheeler to the FCC, former CEO of both NCTA and CTIA.
Tom, you delivered $1 million bribe to the Obama administration, which led to your appointment. You represented the industry for 12 years, and that's all you're going to represent from here on out.
I'm going to ask you...
Answer. When did the FCC go to warn innocent children about getting brain tumors?
Being able to set standards at acceptable safety levels. We have historically done that. We will continue to do that.
We need to speed the deployment of 5G here on our shores. Turning innovators loose is far preferable to expecting committees and regulators to define the future. We won't wait for the standards. Rule number one is that the technology should drive the policy rather than the policy drive the technology. American leadership in 5G must be a national priority.
President Donald Trump has named Ajit Pai, one of the current members of the Federal Communications Commission, to head the agency.
Commissioner Pai, can't you see? Americans want net neutrality! 85% of Republican voters
want net neutrality! Stop representing telecom!
Trump appointed, who is still chairman of the FCC today, radical free market addict Ajit Pai. When it came to repealing net neutrality, Ajit claimed the government had no place in the private sector.
It's very odd to say that getting the government out of the business of regulating the internet is somehow destroying free speech.
But suddenly, for 5G, not only is the government necessary, it's a requirement.
We want America to lead the world in 5G just as we led the world in 4G. That, of course, takes private sector initiative, but also requires government to set the stage in terms of getting the tools for the industry to use out there into the marketplace.
Ajit is playing the same role as his predecessor, claiming the 5G rollout is a global race.
And I've said yesterday and many times that I want the United States to be the leader in terms of 5G innovation.
He and the FCC have devised what they call the 5G Fast Plan.
5G Fast Plan, facilitating America's superiority in 5G technology.
Intending to blanket the entire country with 5G small cells every 2 to 10 homes. The reason industry claims to need so many small cells is because 5G uses millimeter waves, which travel shorter distances and are more easily blocked by walls, even foliage. To compensate for this, engineers have found a way to direct the waves into narrow beams and intentionally point them toward designated areas.
The antenna arrays create this steerable beam, which helps concentrate the energy. The beams get pointed at the user.
But for some reason, the CEO of Verizon has a different story.
Can you get through trees? Can you get through leaves? Can you actually get somewhere where you don't need cell sites 25 feet from my house?
Yeah, well, those were some of what I called the myths of millimeter wave. We have now busted the myth that it has to be line of sight. It does not. We've busted the myth that foliage will shut it down. In the 200 feet from a home, we're now designing the network for over 2,000 feet from transmitter to receiver.
Well, myth or otherwise, small cells are still continuing to be built across the country, and they're a bit closer than 2,000 feet.
Well, hundreds of concerned homeowners in Montgomery County, they don't like this proposal.
The residents say they were never told that it was happening.
I said, how could the town permit this?
She and Woodbury neighbors fuming over the placement of 22 cell repeaters for Verizon in front of homes on what's technically public property without notice or compensation.
I have been telecommuting for a number of years. I used to own a consulting firm. I have never, ever heard anyone say they can't move to Montgomery County for lack of internet access service now.
Wireless providers were pushing for the right to use public rights of way like sidewalks and power poles to install millions of small cell towers.
This is the beginning of a nationwide battle between concerned citizens and big teleco And since Ajit Pai suddenly loves his bureaucracy, he's totally fine having it all mandated by the federal government.
But telecommunications consultant Rusty Monroe says the bill being considered by lawmakers, HB 310, is heavily weighted in favor of providers, not communities.
It should not be about money. It should be about community needs. When we bought into our communities, we bought into residential communities. We did not buy into communities that would have eyesores.
It gives them the authority, as long as they're in the rights of way, to effectively put them wherever they want. 98% of the communities are not going to know how to deal with this issue.
I wish we could change the federal law.
Even the FCC is not a health agency. Keep that in mind. Read the FCC is not a health agency.
Mr. Zients. Just one point. The FCC is not a health agency, but it is a federal agency. And the problem for the county is that we are preempted.
The council members would like to protect the community as much as we can, but federal law does preempt county law. Well, you can say it's not true.
This stuff is untested on kids. Their safety is not certain. These untested technologies are, at this time, not ready to be unleashed into our lives.
If a tower goes up right there, what's going to happen to the value of that home?
It could drop 20%.
And not only for this house.
Right, for that house, that house, that house. And then, pretty soon, you go around the curve and there's another cell tower.
So, with few legal arguments to deny a cell tower, they're popping up outside bedroom windows and school campuses, despite objections from across the country.
I believe that Americans deserve to know what the health effects are.
I can certainly follow up with you, Senator. To my knowledge, there's no active studies being backed by industry today.
No, I'm not aware of any. So there really is no research ongoing. We're kind of flying blind here, so far as health and safety is concerned. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I know there's a convenience issue. I'm addicted to this stuff myself, right? But I also know that in Article 4, Section 51 of our Michigan Constitution, our primary concern is supposed to be the health of our citizens. That is supposed to be the primary concern. And,
With cell phones, we now know, given the evidence and per the hidden recommendations in our phones, not to put it in our pocket or on our ear. But the real danger with 5G is that sooner or later our country will be surrounded by it, and no one knows exactly how it will affect us.